Keith Locke.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Green Party will be supporting this bill as a way of improving the Trans-Tasman cooperation on civil proceedings, on business proceedings. It does build on some of the existing Trans-Tasman legislation. As Charles Chevelle has said, it does make some of the procedures simpler and more affordable. It will enable people to, as Charles said, choose the most appropriate jurisdiction, Australian or New Zealand, in certain circumstances, and expand the range of practical judgments, enforceable judgments. I'll be interested to listen to Leanne Dalzell's comments on the use of penal sanctions across the two countries and who can apply what, because it isn't a straightforward issue. There are questions of basic sovereignty as well, and it's often a bit of a conflict between the sovereignty issues and the practical issues in order for us to conduct Trans-Tasman business in the best possible way and to avoid people escaping civil jurisdiction by running across the Tasman in either direction. So there's a lot going for this bill. But that being said, there's another side to it which Kennedy Graham in the first reading speech referred to as well, in that there can be upsides and downsides to what's been referred to by the previous speakers in the single economic market. If it can also, it can work two ways, as Charles Chevelle said. If you've got similar jurisdictions on both sides of the Tasman, then people won't necessarily lift their assets in one country and take them to the other country, thus disrupting the economies of one or both countries. But on the other hand, what we have seen with the development of the single economic market is in some ways a greater domination of New Zealand by the Australian banks, the Australian-owned supermarkets, and Sydney and Melbourne, with often many head offices disappearing to Sydney or Melbourne, and the Auckland, Christchurch, Wellington offices becoming more and more branch offices of Trans-Tasman companies. That has its upsides and its downsides, but there can be downsides, and also sometimes in relation to the supermarkets, what we've seen is often the supermarkets, the Australian-owned supermarkets, will source more from, because it's part of their Trans-Tasman operation, source from Australian producers and leave the New Zealand producers aside, not because the New Zealand producers are necessarily less efficient, but the economies of scale. Let's just deal with the Australian producers. They can produce for our supermarkets on both sides of the Tasman. So there are problems like that, and we have had problems linking up other regulations, the food standards and the regulations over therapeutic products, which is a still ongoing dispute between Australia and New Zealand. Often we have somewhat different interests, so we have to be a bit careful when we are adopting common procedures that we're not doing them in a way that disadvantages New Zealand as the smaller player. And when we talk about a single economic market, it can mean various things, various levels of integration, but we have to be careful we don't just sort of slip into a common currency or a common reserve bank, which in some ways are the logical consequence of a single economic market. And when you get down to that level, you are getting into problems of economic sovereignty and the problems of different dynamics operating in the economies between the two countries, with the Australian economy governed particularly by the cycles of prices for minerals, stuff they get out of the ground, whereas the New Zealand economy is to a significant extent governed by the prices we get for our dairy products, and those cycles might not synchronise exactly. And I think we've seen in Europe the problems that, and I'm not necessarily against the euro, but we can see certain problems that have developed with the application of the euro in Europe, where the interest rates and operation of the euro has, the different dynamics, say Germany compared with Greece, have meant that what's happening to the euro it might suit Germany and not necessarily suit Greece. So that is a problem with a common currency before you go to some greater political or economic unification. So we have to, as we make these changes, improving our relations across the Tasman, improving our Trans-Tasman coordination of law, we have to always sort of look, are we giving up too much sovereignty or not? Of course, in some Trans-Tasman areas we've been quite successful. We've now got club sporting teams in virtually every Australian sport now, from netball to rugby league, you name it, soccer. We're in an Australian competition, and New Zealand teams, such as the local team in Wellington here, the Phoenix, are doing quite well in those competitions, and the Warriors might get in the top 8 in the NRL and perhaps go further. So there's a lot of Trans-Tasman activity that's very useful, and I'm sure, looking at the other MPs, they're very intrigued with this ending of my speech, but I do, I do indicate that the Green Party will be supporting this bill. Thank you.